Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who've experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about author Karen Moe's book, Victim, a Feminist Manifesto from a Fierce Survivor. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have JoEllen Revell. JoEllen uses she, her pronouns and is the Victim Service Center program director who oversees the advocacy, therapy, and forensic nursing department. She is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years experience in clinical and administrative oversight. So JoEllen, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you, Emilie. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
I am as well, and I'm really excited to also introduce Karen Moe. So Karen uses she, her pronouns and is an art critic, visual and performance artist, author, and feminist activist. Her work focuses on systemic violence and patriarchy, be it gender, race, the environment, or speciesism. Her art criticism has been published internationally in magazines, anthologies, and artist catalogs in English and Spanish, and she has exhibited and performed across Canada, in the US, and in Mexico. She is the founder of the Vigilance Fierce Feminisms Magazine. Karen lives in Mexico City and British Columbia, Canada. So Karen, thank you so much for being here today. We're super excited to have you.
Thank you so much, Emilie and JoEllen and Victim Service Center, for your interest in my story and my book. This is really, really exciting for me to tell you about it.
We're super excited to have you. We're just lucky to be hosting you as an author to chat about your book. So today we're going to talk about Victim, a Feminist Manifesto from a Fierce Survivor, why Karen decided to write this book, honestly, and then what she hopes readers take away from it. So with that, Karen, can you start off a little bit about talking about yourself and your book?
Okay, well, as you said in my bio, I'm a feminist activist, art critic, author. This is my debut book. And I wrote the first sentence in November 2016. So yeah, it's been like my first child, like a very difficult birth. I'm hoping my next one's going to come a bit easier. So yeah, I live in Mexico City and also BC. My life, I kind of go back and forth, but I moved to Mexico City in 2015 because my life since, and this is a big message in my book, since, because of, ironically, the violence that I personally suffered and have survived, my life since then, that's ironically what made me into a revolutionary, because I have lived, and I think anybody who has experienced sexual violence or any kind of violence, if they care to go this route, if they realize it actually is good for you, all of my work and my life is committed to fighting a system, a culture of exploitation that results in sexual violence, along with all the other kinds of violence in a lot of ways. So I moved to Mexico City, to Mexico, because I wanted to experience violence, systemic violence in a quote unquote third world perspective. And I hate those terms, first, third world, developing. I mean, they're problematic. I actually prefer exploiter, exploited. So I went there in 2015 to research violence, also to see what my first world country, is up to down there with their terrible mines, for example. Canada's notorious for that, but no Canadians seem to talk about it. And yeah, and I've learned so much down there. I write about Mexico a lot in my book, what I've learned down there. Yeah, so basically, if you want to know about me, my life is committed to justice in my art and my being. That's so
wow. Thanks for sharing that. I find it fascinating and important to note you started this book multiple years ago, and it was a long journey to get to the end. And I think that's exactly what healing is about. Sometimes you take a little bit of a start, you put something out there, but you have to really be prepared in the space that you're in to move forward. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that maybe gets to kind of why I wrote the book. It's interesting because I've always known I was going to make something out of my story, because my story is really, really interesting. Basically, I was in 1994 in Prescott, Arizona. I was abducted by a serial rapist, and he had me for almost 24 hours. And of course, it was absolutely terrible. I mean, I'm like, all of a sudden I'm being strangled and I'm tied up in the back of a vehicle, and he's got a gun, and and I'm like, oh my God, how did this happen? Like, just all of a sudden, like I say in one of my lines in my book, is I crossed the line if it will never happen to me. Like, and it was just immediately, I'm like, oh my God. And how am I going to get out of this? Like, oh my God, here you are naked, tied up in the back of a vehicle. He's driving you. You're like, anyway, but what happened was, I psychologically overpowered him and got him to let me go. And then I was the one who caught him, because I was the one who got his license plate number. I actually had to go back and get it after I got away. I was like, oh my God, I have to go back and do the right thing. I was just like, I just want to get out of here. But anyway, but what transpired between he and I in this space? I mean, obviously he raped me numerous times. Like, I don't even know, but is really, really interesting. So I've always thought it would make a really, really good screenplay because of what happened in terms of my overpowering him and how smart I was. I was incredibly smart. And so, yeah, but then I decided, as my feminism developed, as my awareness developed, my book is an extremely researched book. It's got like over 270 end notes. It's got like a bibliography of about 45 books. So so basically what I've done is I use my personal story, my narrative, which is really a really interesting story. And then through that, I go into popular culture. I talk about, like I say at one point, that how there's always, I can't remember the monster. There was always the possibility of a monster in every man. And I'm not going to apologize for this essentialism, because if you Google search female serial rapists and murderers, there's not very many, right? So then from that, I go into, because I mentioned in this one part that when he was taking the duct tape off and on my mouth, because every time we were in a public place, like going to a gas station or something, he would put duct tape across my mouth, but he actually apologized for that.
Wow.
He actually said, sorry, I have to do this. I just can't have you, shouting. And I'm like, yeah, and I understood his abductor's logic, right? Like, because there's just all this fascinating interaction. And so, but then from that, I talk about Eileen Wuornos. I talk about, who else I talk about? Oh God, I forget her name right now. Carla Homolka. she was like a murderer in Canada, but she was basically pleasing her boyfriend. So it was like totally conditioned to please your man kind of thing. But, so basically my point is that bringing up this example is from my personal narrative, I go into the big picture. I go into exploitation in general. I talk about PTSD. I talk about sex tourism. I talk about sex slavery. I talk about almost everything.
Wow.
I talk about missing murdered women in Vancouver, Canada, missing predominantly Indigenous women.
Right.
Yeah. So basically in terms of me, I've always known I was going to make something out of it because I'm an artist as well. So I always knew I was going to make something out of it. But as my activism grew and my research, I'm also an independent scholar, grew, I'm like, okay, this can't just be a movie. This is going to be like, it's a very research book. It could be taught in a women's studies class, for example. It could be taught in university, a gender studies class. It could be taught, but then the way I wrote it so that it doesn't go from the anecdotal into like academies, so to speak. Like I wrote it, so I really worked hard, and I worked really hard with an editor to have the voice, so it's accessible to everybody. You don't have to have gone to university to read it. And there's lots of end notes, and you don't have to read the end notes if you don't want to. You can just go right in. So I'm hoping it will be able to reach a really broad audience.
Yeah, the appeal for various audiences is super important. Thank you for sharing about what happened to you. Not everyone is willing to put out publicly such a story. A lot of times our victims have a lot of shame, and until they become a survivor or a thriver, they don't often voice that. So again, thank you for being here to share, and then having your book so that others can kind of really do a deep dive if they want to read and understand better your experience and how it's changed you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And also like hearing you kind of reference, and I was able to read the introduction and hearing kind of how your story, you're applying it to the bigger picture of these systems of power and control, and how they relate to this crisis of violence happening, and that continues to happen. I wanted to ask you, and you started kind of answering it already, but kind of this idea of, how did you decide what point of view to use and other like literary components to use for your work? This seems like a really monumental goal, really, to talk about these really big systems of power and control and how they relate to violence. So how did you kind of decide to choose specific literary components?
Sure. Well, for one thing, I'm an artist, so the book is a work of literature. I'm a writer. I'm not a straight writer. I'm not a journalist. Of course, I admire that form of writing, but I'm an artist. So that's why, in terms of it not being a linear narrative, and also we don't remember linearly, right? So you're remembering something, and then then there'll be a touchstone in that memory that will go into something that is not the thing that happened next. So when I started to write it, the first line that I would love to read to you, the first the first piece. But when I started to write it, when I talk about writing, it's like the miracle of a first line. And it's the same with songwriting. It's the miracle, and it tears me up talking about this, because just the miracle of a first sentence. And then,
are you able to share it? Your first sentence sounds.
I'm gonna read it to you, and then you'll hear my first sentence. But okay, I'll tell you the first sentence, and then I'll read it to you. Yeah, this is the first sentence that came to me in November 2016. And then it's almost like when you have your first sentence, it's almost like in a way the book or the essay is written. It's just amazing. It's just amazing. It's like this
awesome
gift. So this is this first sentence that came to me. I have lost the mustard yellow suede jacket from that time.
Well, that's kind of profound. I'm sure there's layers to what that means.
Yeah. I also love that jacket, and I did lose it. But that was the first sentence that got me into it. So yeah,
Wow.
and then I go, okay, so yeah, so and then of course the whole thing about the book being a document, like a manifesto. And manifestos, it's I call it a manifesto for a reason, because manifestos, they're very, very necessary right now. I mean, people might think in a lot of ways things are better, but in a lot of ways things are worse. We've got a lot of internalized sexism going on in a lot. So this is the time we really need manifestos, and manifestos not just expose what's going on and really systematize it through research. And I believe that when you're going to make big claims, big statements, they got to be backed up. Like, you know, like with the internet, like everybody can say anything they want now, and of course it's freedom of speech. But when you're going to make big statements, you got to back it up, because you can't just be saying something without any kind of historical context or cultural literacy. So, and the thing about manifestos is that they offer a solution. They offer hope. And Robert Jensen, this wonderful writer, American, he wrote The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. One of the great things he wrote is that I write how we can find authentic hope. What a wonderful thing to someone else to have acknowledged. So yeah, so my book started with that line.
Wonderful.
And right away, I have the first passage where I get right into victim blaming. So I'll read you the first part of Victim, a Feminist Manifesto from a Fierce Survivor. This is the first public reading I've ever done on your Victim Service Center podcast. Part 1. I got into the vehicle. He had offered me a lift back to my motel. I knew it was wrong, but I got in anyway. Some of you might think that I was stupid and that I had it coming. It was all my fault. But does that mean I deserved what is going to happen next? December 19th, 1994, around 5 p.m., Flagstaff, Arizona. I have lost the mustard yellow suede jacket from that time. Maybe I gave it away and then asked for it back. Maybe I still have it packed in a box in storage. Maybe it's lost. It had a Dino pin on the lapel, platinum, about 1.5 inches tall. I have always loved the Flintstones, Barney and Dino in particular. The jacket was used, vintage before vintage was vintage. I don't remember where I bought it. Did I buy it long before it happened, just before, on the brink of during? I remember that it barely covered my bum. It had slouching pockets from past hands. It was a bit tight across the chest and shoulders when I did the buttons up. Even when I was very slim, I was still well endowed, both a blessing and a curse. I used to wear it unbuttoned most of the time so as not to appear frumpy. It was ridiculous that I would even have considered that. Has anyone seen my mustard yellow suede jacket? I had checkered leggings. They were secondhand too, black and white, some retro petroleum fabric that Gen Xers like myself made retro. I wear them so regularly that the knees were baggy, and there was a little hole on one knee with a small vertical run. I wore them almost all the time anyway. I always wore very colorful socks, maybe stitched with another Flintstone character or one from Peanuts, probably Snoopy or Woodstock. I would have tucked the checkered leggings into my very colorful socks and then pull on my electric blue Doc Martens. Yes, I think I wore my Docs then, but I have no pictures from that time to prove it. Every part of my ensemble was lighthearted except for my shirt. I've always had challenges with shirts. The boobs blessing curse again. It was a plain black t-shirt, not fitted, a crew neck that is always a no-no when you have breasts larger than a B cup. The shirt hung like a block. Like the jacket, the t-shirt just covered my bum. I don't think it hung lower than the jacket, although I remember wishing it did. I remember wishing a lot of things about that t-shirt as I fussed with it daily in front of the mirror. Sometimes it would take me quite a while to get outside and do the sightseeing I come there to do and have the adventures that awaited my curious mind. I was chained to the mirror, scolding myself for not packing a skirt, pulling the t-shirt tight around my waist from behind and wishing I had a clip to keep it there. Maybe the unsexy shirt was a way of concealing my sexuality, the always violatable young womanhood. And yet, even though the t-shirt was far from fetching, I still felt exposed. Whatever the pathology, it didn't matter. I was in danger despite any inadvertent attempt to be invisible. The motel was a very scary place. So much so that the memory of the motel cancels out the fact that I may have gone to some prehistoric cave houses along the way, Red Cliffs, a bus tour, but I'm not sure. If I did, the experience is like a fading dream, a blur caught in mid-maybe. Lying on the well-used bed, looking up at the cracked ceiling, I could feel the thousands of sordid things that had happened there. The springs squeaked when I got up to prove it. My body knew there was danger 24 hours before it began. Flagstaff, Arizona, Route 66. I was born in 1966, and I remember trying to console myself with this connection, even though Route 66 kind of scared me too. Get your kicks on Route 66. I always wondered what the kicks were. I knew they were supposed to be fun, but the whole idea seemed ominous to me. Like all the women Jim Morrison had had sex with or something, or the first time I read Henry Miller, or even A Catcher in the Rye. I hadn't read On the Road yet, but I bet Dean Moriarty got some of his kicks on Route 66 too. Knowing what I know now, it was absolute madness that I was there alone. I was immersing myself in Handgun Central USA, in a hotbed of gender violence, in the birthplace of slasher B movies. But I didn't know any of this. Despite this pang of awareness in the scary motel room, I was entirely oblivious. I prided myself in being an adventurer, living life to the fullest, learning, experience, writing, thinking, being a free spirit, like men could. I had no idea that women are not allowed to do this. I was perfect prey.
Amazing.
Thanks.
The visual interpretation, for me, it's really amazing and profound. Thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's really powerful, Karen. Thanks so much for sharing that. As you were talking, I was thinking you were talking about the first sentence, and I wanted to hear from you. It sounded like explaining or describing your clothing was really important. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Why did you choose so much to focus on the clothes and kind of the implication of you losing this well-loved jacket?
Mustard yellow suede jacket.
Yes.
Super retro with the big lapel. It was awesome jacket. Yeah. Anyway, well, I mean, like any first sentence when you're a writer, I mean, it's just like I said, it's just like a miracle that comes to you. But so when it came to me, I wasn't consciously thinking that I was going to be focusing on the clothing. I mean, obviously the sentence came, and that's something that, and I mean, I guess the mustard yellow suede jacket, it's I really liked it. And it was also the jacket that I was wearing during the entire abduction. It was the jacket that I had on. So that jacket in itself is just filled, it's just packed with so much significance and memory and life experience. And the fact that I've lost it is kind of interesting too. Mm-hmm. So as a writer and as an artist, you know, you don't tell everything. You know, you want to leave gaps. So you come at things kind of sideways. And then it's much more interesting. It's much more of a textured read. It's much more of a textured visual art experience or a film. So yeah. So I mean, I've been making art for a long time. So I'm very blessed in that it just comes to me, and I know that I just have confidence that it's going to go somewhere good. And so, yeah, so it's kind of a mystery, but at the same time, when you think about it, and this is something that also inadvertently happened, Because when you're an artist, you're very in tune to the world. Because artists are curious.
Mhm.
If you have curious mind, you have the capacity. Like if you're really, it's not just a bit curious, it's acutely curious. You're very, very interested in everything is interesting. Nothing is boring. So
Mhm.
that's what gives you the ability after years of honing that skill. And so, I mean, you probably have it since you were a kid. Like I remember being very curious kid and everything being kind of, oh, that's really anyway, weird or interesting. But inevitably what you create is going to be connected to society, to culture in a sharp way. So I mean, when you think about it, I was a young woman, and well, most young women are pretty concerned with their appearance. So, and I mean, my fussing, like I used to fuss in the mirror, and I was slim. I see pictures of myself. It's like, what was I worried about? But I would fuss in front of the mirror, like that whole thing about my t-shirt being hanging like a block and wishing I had a clip. That happened.
Mhm.
So, and then there's another part in the story where I also talk about my shoes and my shoes, my clothes, but it happens to be my shoes, where I was planning what I'm going to wear to the rape trial, you know. And I make a joke about, what to wear to a rape trial kind of thing, kind of like, what do you wear to your wedding? And, and maybe we should plan this considering, what the percentages of women who are raped. Maybe you should plan your rape trial outfit just the same as you plan your wedding dress. But I mean, I have real dark sense of humor. So, but it is, I think it'll make people laugh anyway. But I talk about these green shoes. And I get down to the rape trial, like in Ventura, where the trial was, and I'm like, why? I mean, and the shoes seemed like a great idea when I chose them, and I was in Vancouver. I get down there, I'm like, why did I choose these shoes? They're like cheap and tacky, and they're going to connect to the defense attorney is going to do the usual thing and try to make the victim into a slut that she asked for, being strangled and having her like, oh yeah, that was really great. I was just looking for that kind of thing. Anyway, so I'm looking at these shoes, but then from these shoes, I go into what I just told you about the defense attorney doing this typical thing, which he gave me actually a gift because I made it so ridiculous. I had the jury laughing, like as if I was looking for that, right? Anyway, so, but yeah, so it's just these touchstones, but it's interesting that they often do end up being clothing. I don't know if there's any more, but yeah.
I will definitely want to jump in because I think the point is valid. I know when we have individuals who have their forensic evidence collected, we sometimes hear these requests for something to be given back, like, oh, but I really want those jeans, or that was my favorite bra. And we have to explain for evidence, like this is going to be kept. And there's this connection to an item. And it feels like the loss is like, I'm going to lose that. And I've already lost enough. Can I just have that back feeling, if you will?
Mm-hmm. I was actually, the whole reason I was there was because I had left my husband because I had kind of a sad marriage where my husband ended up being a drug addicted person and I had to leave him. And so my whole thing is I was looking for a town with a little mountain I could climb because I was writing a letter to him and I was going to have a little ritual where I burned the letter on the mountain and then the ashes. That's my whole reason why I was there. So, because I'd been in Las Vegas visiting some friends, and I'm like, oh, I'll go to Arizona and look for this little mountain to burn the letter, which I never got to do because the guy abducted me and I never got to burn my letter. So, yeah, so that's just when I was in Flagstaff. And then the next day was when I found Prescott and it has a little mountain. So, yeah, so all of the sexual assaults that I experienced happened in his camper van that he just, got.
I once lived in Tucson, so I'm able to kind of really visualize what you mean by the little mountain. So,
yeah.
And you also decided to, and I'm glad you already referenced it, but that's what stuck out to me too, is kind of the nonlinear part of it, where you're kind of jumping around in different kind of times and kind of to me as a reader, I was thinking, oh, I wonder if this is kind of to highlight the very normal response of, that's like highlighting memories and how those who are affected by trauma, sometimes it can affect their memory as well. And it sounds like that was maybe what you were trying to get across in that intro.
Yeah, well, if so, it was inadvertent. I mean, for me, it was mostly the process of remembering, and and I guess that I mean, I never had my own trial, which is something that I also talk about. It's quite interesting in that I never had my own trial, and so I had never was interrogated in that way. And I don't know if when you're interrogated, if they expect your remembering to be linear. They very well could, because we live in a linear prioritizing, patriarchy is a linear system. So yeah, I mean, it was more just for me, it was the process of remembering, and also a literary, and it was just the way it was coming out, right? Like after that part I just read to you, all of a sudden it's 1997 and I'm arriving at the Ventura airport for the trial. But then I go back to when he had me in the desert. But when we were editing it, we made these like dates sometime in 1997, late afternoon, Ventura County, California, so that the reader knows,
Can
that
piece it together.
where we're moving around. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it works. I don't think that people are going to get lost.
No, not at all. I think that was just a really interesting choice, and I thought that it was very grabbing. Where and I think I love hearing kind of your process of remembering and things like that. So I appreciate that. You're referencing a few important, I think, terms that we might want to define. And of course, JoEllen, you can jump in too. But you reference patriarchy a lot. And even in this conversation, and I don't think we ever actually on this podcast is like, we've done over 100 of these. I don't think we've ever actually defined what the patriarchy is or what we mean by patriarchy. So would either of you be comfortable kind of giving a definition of what that is?
Sure.
I think Karen should do it from her perspective as the writer. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, patriarchy is a male-defined system. Patriarchy started, there's a wonderful book by Gerda Lerner called The Creation of Patriarchy. She's a historian. Patriarchy started with the beginning of private property and ownership. And women were the first slaves, because women, in terms of their reproductive capacity, that's an aspect of private property. So women were the first slaves. So that's why feminism is really important aspect of revolution, because we were the first slaves. So we're like the foundation of patriarchy, and patriarchy is a hierarchical based system. Hierarchy has to exploit in order to exist, because the top of a hierarchy has to take from those beneath. So we have all of our levels of hierarchy. In imperial culture, in culture that is based in European colonization of the world, of course, it's the white man who's on top, and then you have the white women, then you have the people of color, then you have, the animals and the earth. And of course, you've got trans women in there and trans in there as well. So yeah, so it's a serious, it has to exist. It has to exploit in order to exist. So from a feminist perspective, and feminism is not quote unquote just about women. Feminism is about dismantling patriarchal hierarchy, and patriarchal hierarchy is also male supremacist. And patriarchal hierarchy is not good for men either, because it also, patriarchal hierarchy exploits everything. I mean, maybe patriarchal hierarchy is good for the CEOs just right at the very top, having a good time. But it's probably pretty bad for their soul if you want to, get into that level. It's all about this system of oppression. That's what patriarchy is, and it's what needs to be dismantled. And I always say, basically, what we really need is we need an ideological revolution. We need to like realize that we have to transform this vertical, this linear way of being to a horizontal way of being, a lateral way of being. So yeah, basically going from, to make it really kind of a spatial thing, going from the vertical, reaching up to the sky gods that are always male and ignoring the earth, and going from into a horizontal way of perceiving the world.
I appreciate you bringing up that it also hurts men too. We've had a few episodes about toxic masculinity, for example, where men aren't able to express different emotions that aren't related to anger. So it is kind of a system that we're all kind of trapped in. Of course, there are some, there's a difference between like oppression and being hurt by it. But I appreciate you kind of giving a clear picture of that. You also use the term rape culture a lot. We've done a lot of episodes on that. I didn't know if you had a perspective on that exactly, how you would define rape culture.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, rape culture is a culture that rapes. So to me, I guess in a way, rape culture could be basically a culture that exploits.
Yeah. And I would add to that, I agree what you're saying, Karen. The idea for me of rape culture is where there's this prevailing kind of making excuses for sexual assault and sexual abuse, where we see it all too often. In America, in North America, in probably anywhere, but it's just swept under the rug, or it's laughed about, or it's not taken as seriously as it actually is.
Yeah, or there's myths about it, and I think a really big piece to rape culture is victim blaming. That's a huge one. And you were talking already about it. And I think there can be a lot of, blaming the victim internally too, of, why did I choose to do that thing, when the blame should always be put on the perpetrator, right? We don't ask people to enact violence on us, but that is a huge piece of rape culture as well. Are there any other terms that you'd like to kind of define before we kind of dive a little more deeper into the story?
Yeah, I just want to add that the internalized aspect of victim blaming is like, we internalize it, and I talk about that quite a bit in my book, because I did that. It's things like internalized sexism, and that really connects to your post-traumatic stress as well, because you're re-traumatizing yourself by blaming yourself as well. And yeah, so victim blaming basically being, the whole thing, if she asked for it, it was all her fault, which I talk about a lot in the book. But in terms of other terms, yeah, I mean, the other terms are the whole idea of unfounded, when a woman goes and reports a rape, and then it's deemed unfounded, which means, okay, it didn't happen. And this happens a lot. And in the book, I like, when I was finished the book, I read this wonderful book by Robin Doolittle called Had It Coming, What's Fair in the Age of Me Too. And she talked about this case that happened the exact same time as my case, 1994. And it was in Canada. And she was assaulted, and her rape was deemed unfounded, like basically not enough evidence, whatever. And I didn't have my own trial. My trial ended up being, because when the guy, when he let me go, or I got away, however you want to look at it, he went to Ventura, where he burgled, and he basically left a 65-year-old woman for dead. And so it became a potential homicide. So that's why the case got really big. But I mean, I was thinking, wait a second, if I had my own trial just for me, if it only been about me, it probably in the 90s would have been deemed unfounded. So I've always thought, oh, I wish I had my trial. But then I'm like, wait a second, maybe it was a good thing I didn't have my own trial. So yeah, so it's so the term unfounded. Also, you asked about, I think you asked me about femicides, for feminicidios. I mean, we all know what that is, right? Like women, the epidemic of women being murdered. There's like 12 to 16 women murdered every day in Mexico by their boyfriends. And spouses, by the way.
Wow.
So yeah, it's pretty hardcore. And I already talked about manifesto. One thing I'd like to talk about quickly is individualism. We live in basically another aspect of North American culture. It's predominantly North American culture that is the individualist. So Canada and the States. Basically, part of my manifesto is we have to get beyond the individual. So we have to care beyond ourselves. And that's something that, for me, as a victim and survivor, another thing I should probably talk about is Victim, the name of my book. But because a lot of people say, why did you call your book Victim? It's so negative. And, it is and it isn't. So getting beyond ourselves and my experience got me beyond myself. It made me start doing something about it because I knew in my body that there's a real problem. So, the individual and getting beyond ourselves and empathy, like I said in another interview recently, the rape of a child is just as unforgivable as the rape of a child you don't know. So just thinking of it on those terms.
Yeah, for sure. That kind of reminds me of our active bystander training too, right? Like you can be that person to jump in and help, and that individualism is part of it, right? Caring about even strangers. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Absolutely.
Yeah. Did you want me to mention something about why I named my book Victim?
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit more about how you even came up with the title of your book.
It's always been the title. Yeah. Well, basically the way it evolved exactly was that I knew this guy when I was probably it was like a year after or right around the time I was 28 I was also raped when I was 19. I was given the GHB in Montreal, which I talk about. That's another story. I write about that in the book. But anyway, I was hanging out where I was in his house and I went into his bathroom and he had all these books about serial killers. Like Clifford Olson and who's that other guy that there was a Netflix series, Ted Bundy, yeah, and all these books about serial killers. And I'm like, and I came out and I said, well, why do you have all these books about serial killers? Why are you sensationalizing this? And he said to me, oh, victims are boring. And I said to myself right then and there, well, I was a victim and I sure wasn't boring. So that's when it became called Victim. And then also, and I found out, because I've also always thought, sure, you're a survivor, you survived, okay? But once you've experienced really extreme violence, you change. You're always a victim. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing because because through your victimization, you can turn that trauma into triumph because you have, like I've said a couple of times, you have a embodied, a lived knowledge of what is wrong. And you can commit yourself beyond yourself using that knowledge, using that victimization, using that transformation of your life to help others and to try work towards being a voice to transform an exploitation system of exploitation in general.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it, where that an action and how your adrenaline kicks up and your brain kind of learns that response, seeing that as in some ways it could be helpful in the future. But I love your take on things, because we don't often hear from victims when they're acutely victimized. They're not at that place to be able to reflect back yet on the experience. And it's those who've went through, whether it's years of therapy, counseling, other interventions, that they can truly kind of talk about the story almost separate from themselves, almost as if it's a play, a movie, or someone else's experience. Because it's, I can see people here very much right after an assault, and their presentation is quite different than those who've healed. Have had time away from the episode. So thank you for sharing that. It's making me think a little bit more about how we work with people.
Yeah. And it actually leads me to another question that I had, which is, how did you know when you were ready to actually write this?
When the first sentence came into my head, I don't know. I mean, yeah. Actually, I can tell you when it was. I have always thought this idea, like I've always found that just using the term survivor, I've always found it as not being 100% correct. That I've always felt that it's kind of been a term that's erased, like you just kind of you can move on, and that, like, you're supposed to make everything that happened to you go away, and I don't think that's possible. I don't think we should ever forget what happens to us, because if we forget about it, then it's just going to keep happening. So I don't think it's realistic to think that you are no longer a victim. But that doesn't mean you're, like, I basically called like victim / survivor, like I'm both. And so I've thought this for, I don't know, since when was I abducted? 94. And when I started, really thinking about it was probably the late 90s. But then I was reading Roxane Gay, and I don't remember which book it is right now. Anyway, and she said, and her book was, her book, I don't know, I can't remember. It's like in the 2000s. And she said, I like to think of myself as not just a survivor now, I'm more of a victim. And I was like, oh my God, somebody agrees with me. Because quite often people were saying, well, victim's such a negative term. And I was so happy finally to see someone agreeing with me. And then kind of miraculously, this sentence came. I have, lost the master's will back from the time. And yeah, so I think that was definitely a big thing when I actually read another victim, because she survived something terrible as well, thinking the same way. And I was like, oh my God, that's so awesome. And then I was
wow. Yeah, I think it's important that people get to self-define where they are and how they define themselves, and allowing that person to make the choice. Here, because of the name of our agency, some people think it should be not called Victim Service Center, but I believe like that defines what we're doing. We're servicing victims. When someone is able to call themselves a survivor or wants to do that, then that's self-determination, and that's really about, it's giving people their right to self-determine and options about defining themselves. So it's an interesting take. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. We've had a lot of different survivors on here, and they all kind of have their own take on these different terms that we talk about: victim, survivor, thriver. And it's such a privilege to kind of hear their reasons to why they identify as this. And some survivors have changed depending on the day, right? How they're feeling that day. They're like, today I feel more this way, that way. And I can't agree with JoEllen more, just giving people that ability to define how they feel, because this is about power and control, and they have a right to define how they want to define and identify. So I appreciate that. And thank you so much for talking a little bit more about why you chose that particular title for your book. As far as, the writing process, how did that go? Is it exhausting? Did you find it healing? Did you ever have to walk away from writing? Just kind of the process. We know that you started a few years back, so it was kind of a longer process too.
Well, taking 3 years to write a book is actually not very long. It took me 3 years, and it took me 3 years to get it published. The writing part is the joy. It's the joy. I mean, especially if you're a writer, if you're an artist, the art creation, and of course writing is art. That's the joy, and having the time to do it. I also have to work. Like I mean, I don't, hopefully my book will sell a lot, and then I will be able to, my next book is going to be about sex trafficking, and it's going to be called Inconceivable Reality. And I really hope that my book sells enough so that I'm able to totally dedicate myself to that, because that is every artist's dream, to be able to 100% just do what you were meant to do what gives you the most joy. So in terms of the writing part, no, because I'm an artist and that's all I want to do. So in terms of the publishing part, though, that's another story. I mean, that's just been absolutely, in a lot of ways, traumatizing. I mean, it's just been so hard. Yeah, and I'm really hoping my next one is not going to be as hard. So yeah, I just really hope people really like my book and want to read my story and also share, my research and my message, and also will help me write my next book. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I was curious to know, I always like asking this when we have artists and authors on, such as yourself. I always like to ask, what is something that you want the reader to take away from your book?
Oh, okay. Well, probably the manifesto part. I mean, obviously I want the reader to enjoy my book. Like, even though it's a terrible story, believe it or not, there's actually even some funny parts. And it has a happy ending. I tell people that, like in video part 2, just in case you're starting to get bummed out, it's got a happy ending. And so I think the main thing I want people to take away from it is the manifesto aspect, and how in order for there to be any because I'm a revolutionary. That's what I do, and it's not, quote unquote, just about violence against women. It's environmentalism, it's speciesism, it's animals and being tortured to be made into our pork chops. So because everything is connected. And so the main message I want to relay is for people to start to exist and to care and to be beyond themselves. And I've always talked about it as the politic of empathy. And position yourself in the hierarchy that is what we live in. We live in patriarchal hierarchy. So where are you? Okay. So, and become self-reflexive with that and aware. And okay, how am I complicit in this? How are even my thoughts complicit in this?
With that, Karen, I just wanted, with the few minutes that we have left with each other, I wanted to know where people can find and purchase your book. Where can they follow you? All that good stuff.
Okay. Well, my book, just Victim, a Feminist Manifesto from a Fierce Survivor, just went on pre-order. So it's up on all the big book buying sites: Amazon, Kobo, Barnes and Noble, Apple Books, Google Play. It'll soon be up on IndieBound and bookshop.org. In Canada, it's Chapters Indigo. I'm pretty sure it's up there. And I'm working to get it into bookstores, of course. And there's some independent bookstores that are carrying it. I'm going to be on my tour, which I'd love to tell you a bit about in a minute. It's going to be available in Bookman's. It's a bookstore in Arizona. Two Friends Books in Bentonville, Arkansas. Spartacus Books in Vancouver. Western Sky Books in Port Coquitlam, BC. And probably People's Co-op Bookstore in Vancouver. And obviously, I want to get it into, like, they're called the brick and mortar stores, like the hard copy books on display. But that takes sales, so pre-sales. If people want to buy my book in advance, the literal launch is April 2nd. But the more people buy the pre-sales, the more of a chance it is to get on the Amazon bestseller list, and all of it kind of rolls out. People can follow me. Check out my website, KarenMoeAuthor.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. If you sign up for my newsletter, you get the first 21-page preview. And of course, with my newsletter, you'll be finding out everything about more podcasts, I hope, about interviews, about launch dates, about readings, about promotions, where you'll be able to get the book for even less. I'm on Instagram, Karen Moe Art. I'm also Vigilance Magazine. I'm on Facebook. yeah, so that's basically, you can buy my book right through my website, or you can go to, the bookseller online that you like to go to as well.
It's so timely with Sexual Assault Awareness Month being in April. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, well, that worked out really, really well. So
it certainly did.
yeah, so the way I've been planning my tour, as you know, because of course that's how I connected with Victim Service Center, is I'm kind of obsessive compulsive, and I don't call it a disorder, because to be an artist and to be someone who like really promotes yourself and tries to do stuff, you have to be obsessive. So I contacted at least 3 sexual assault centers in each state in the United States, and the ones who have responded to me it's the way I've planned my tour. So basically, the first place I'm going to Springdale, Arkansas, and I've never been to Arkansas, so I'm pretty interested in that experience. And I'm going to be presenting at the NWA Center for Sexual Assault Gala on the 8th, which is going to be great. And then I'm going to be in the same town. I'm going to be presenting at Two Friends Books, and every town that I visit, I'm donating $1 from the sale of each book to a sexual assault nonprofit in that town or city. So in that town, of course, it will be the NWA Center for Sexual Assault. And then I'm going to Tucson, Arizona, where I'm presenting with Bookman's Books, and that's going to be on the 12th or 13th. We haven't exactly decided what the events will be. I'm speaking with James, the main guy, tomorrow. And then I'm doing something really exciting that a lot of people think I'm crazy to do, but I'm super excited about it. I'm going back to Prescott, Arizona, where I was abducted. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's a strong woman right there. Wow.
Well, I've got my book. My book is my armor. And as an artist as well, it's like, it's even your own emotions, like your own trauma is interesting. So, getting outside of, I'm going to go into the saloon where I met the Birdcage Saloon, where the serial rapist first started stalking me. So I'm going to be presenting there at the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Yavapai. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. College, and Prescott College. And then I might go to New York to do something with Sally Clark. She wrote The Way of the Warrior Mama, the guide to raising and protecting strong daughters. And then maybe I'll come down and visit Victim Services Center in Florida. I sure hope so. And then I'm going.
Us too, we hope.
Yeah. And I can. I've got some days free. And then I'm going to Project Sister in Pomona, California for the Denim Day. I'm going to do something with them. And then my last stop, another exciting thing. Well, they're all exciting, but this is really significant in terms of the book. I'm going to Ventura, California, where the trial was. And I've reconnected, and I'm going to be their keynote speaker for the National Crime Victims' Rights event.
Yes, that's amazing. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm pretty stoked about that.
Wow, these are all really significant locations. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And hopefully we can kind of share exactly what that tour is so that we can post it on our social media or things like that, so that people can kind of see where your tour is and hopefully join if they're able. As a final kind of thought, do you have anything that you'd like to tell the survivors out there, or their supporters, or just people in general?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, basically what I've said about what my message of my book, but I mean, in terms of victims and survivors, just the whole thing that you can turn your trauma into triumph. And I think that I have bipolar 2, and it's not the bipolar 1 that where I've ever been hospitalized, but the depressions can get pretty severe. And I what I've realized is that if you want to, I mean, obviously, if you have a mental illness, you've got a mental illness, and it's a huge struggle. And maybe you're lucky enough, like I am, to have found some medication that doesn't have a lot of side effects and that I can function on, which has saved my life. But help somebody else. Get outside of yourself is the best thing to do for any kind of mental illness and trauma. Just get outside, because when you have it, you're like obsessing in your mind. And it's just like all these terrible feelings in your mind. But as soon as you like reach out and try and volunteer at a sexual assault organization, volunteer some social justice that touches you, that will help you as well. And yeah, and in terms of people in general, I mean, I think that almost everybody has some kind of victimization when we live in a system of exploitation, but of course it's all varying, levels of privilege. But learn self-reflexivity, like I said, where are you positioned in this system of exploitation, and take responsibility for it. Yeah. And another thing that you can do is you can buy my book and read it.
Absolutely. Your point was one that's well taken about like helping someone else. Sometimes we do see our volunteers who have maybe a shared lived experience. When they're ready, it's important for some healing, a different level of healing, a different path to closure. So always with us, we want to make sure they're ready and it's the right time for them, and knowing about that. Or, sometimes we realize a support group could be similar to what you were saying, like the reaching out to someone else. So
yeah, I always love hearing the individuality of healing, how certain things work for some survivors and certain things work for others. So I always appreciate kind of hearing what has been healing for survivors. And I appreciate you sharing that. And before we sign off, either you, JoEllen, or you, Karen, is there anything else you would like to mention that we might not have discussed?
I just want to say, like, we're obviously going to share information about Karen and about the book on our social media platforms. And we encourage individuals who might have been impacted by this unedited conversation to reach out, whether it's to us or to wherever they're hearing this, to a local rape crisis center, because there is certainly help out there. All of our services are free, and whatever is the reason that you're reaching out, because if you're reading a book or hearing this, we're here to help, and we would love to work with individuals who need that help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just like that the whole having sexual assault centers. It's amazing thing. In Mexico, they don't really exist because the victim blaming there, like they basically just say, oh, well, even when a woman was killed, they say, oh, she committed suicide, the authorities. So we have so many wonderful, wonderful services in Canada and the United States that Vancouver Rape Relief in Vancouver, Canada, when I first got back, they were so incredibly helpful to me, and I'm eternally grateful. So thank you for all the work you do and all of the help that you give, especially when someone has been recently raped, and it's just so traumatizing and confusing, and you just need people to talk to you who know what they're talking about and who are not going to give you even a smidgen of victim blaming.
I appreciate hearing that. And we really thank you for taking the time out of your busy and very exciting right now.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you've got a lot going on, Karen. I want to thank the listener just real quick for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. To learn more about Karen, visit KarenMoe.author.com, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And I just can't thank you enough, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Emilie and JoEllen. It was so great to meet you, and I hope to meet you in real life.
Absolutely. Thank you.